The billionaire prince spoke in Nigerian, and only the black maid replied, silencing everybody. Welcome to Dusk Tales. Let's uncover what really happened. The dust motes danced in the slanted afternoon light, visible only to the one who moved slow enough to see them. To Ada, they were a silence, swirling symphony, in the grand sterile concert hall of the St. Regis Hotel. She moved through the opulent corridors, with a practiced invisibility, her presence as subtle as the scent of lavender polish she used on the mahogany railings. Her cart, with its neatly arranged bottles and folded cloths, was her partner in this dance of effacement. It was a good cart, its wheels oiled to a whisper, never betraying her passage through a world that was not her own. People didn't see a woman named Ada. They saw a uniform, a function, a pair of hands that made smudges disappear. They saw the quiet and the clean that followed in her wake, but never the source. Ada had learned to prefer it this way. In the quiet, she could remember. She could remember the rust-red earth of Abadan, the cacophony of the market, the weight of her grandmother's hand in hers. She could remember the crisp pages of the textbooks she had once devoured, the dreams of architecture and design that had carried her through university, dreams that now lay dormant, under layers of pragmatism and circumstance. Here, in the hushed, air-conditioned stillness of other people's luxury, those memories were her only true possessions. They were vibrant and loud in the silent theater of her mind, a stark contrast to the muted beige and polished chrome of her daily reality. Her movements were economical, her face a mask of serene neutrality. It was a mask she had perfected over 3 years, a necessary armor against the casual disregard of the hotel's clientele. They spoke around her, through her, their voices awash with the easy confidence of wealth and status, discussing stock options and summer homes in the Hamptons. As she knelt to wipe a scuff from the Italian marble, she was a ghost in their machine, a necessary but unseen cog. And today, the machine was buzzing with a particular intensity. A new guest had arrived, one whose presence sent ripples through the entire establishment. They called him a prince, a title that sounded both ancient and modern. Prince Kelo Abaya, of the Asa Kingdom, a small but resource-rich territory in Nigeria, though his empire was thoroughly modern, a sprawling tech conglomerate, with global reach. He was a billionaire, many times over, a figure of mythic proportions, who moved between the worlds of ancestral royalty and futuristic innovation. The staff spoke of him in hushed, reverent tones. The managers scurried with a nervous energy, their usual professional calm fractured by the scale of the visitor. For Ada, he was just another name on a long list of the powerful and transient, who rented space in her world. Yet, she felt a faint, unfamiliar flicker of curiosity. Nigeria. The word itself was a homeland she held in her heart, a place she hadn't seen in 6 years. She wondered what part of the country he was from, if the cadence of his English held traces of a familiar tongue, a rhythm she knew from her childhood. It was a foolish thought, a small crack in her carefully constructed wall of detachment, and she quickly polished it away, focusing on the microscopic imperfections in a gilded mirror, the only thing she was paid to see. Prince Kelo Abaya did not move like the other wealthy guests. There was an economy to his motion, a stillness in his core that seemed to command space rather than just occupy it. He was tall and carried himself with an innate regality that had nothing to do with the bespoke suit he wore. It was in his eyes, which were old and observant, taking in the world with a weary acuity. His entourage, however, was a different story. They were a flock of sharp suits and sharper smiles, their voices loud and self-important, as they swept through the lobby. Leading them, or at least attempting to, was Mr. Robert Davenport, the senior vice president of a massive American energy corporation. Davenport was a man who seemed perpetually flushed, either from exertion or a surfeit of his own significance. His smile was wide and predatory, his handshakes firm and brief. He orbited Kelo with a cloying attentiveness, his laughter a beat too loud, his posture a study in sycophantic deference. Ada was wiping down the elevator doors when the procession passed. She flattened herself against the wall, her gaze lowered, becoming part of the decor. Davenport's voice sliced through the air. "Prince Kelo, we have the penthouse suite secured for you. Of course. The finest view of the city. Anything you require, anything at all, you need only ask. Kalo's response was a low murmur, almost lost in the ambient noise. But it was in that moment that something unexpected happened. As the group moved towards the elevators, Kalo's gaze drifted away from the fawning executives and swept across the periphery. For a fraction of a second, his eyes met Ada's. It was not the vacant, unseeing stare she was accustomed to. It was a look of acknowledgement, a simple, fleeting recognition of her existence, of a person standing there. In his eyes she saw not a cleaner, but a fellow countrywoman perhaps. A flicker of shared geography, a silent nod across a chasm of wealth and status. Then he was gone, the polished steel doors closing him off. But the moment lingered. It was a small thing, a stone tossed into the still pool of her anonymity. Ada felt a strange warmth spread through her chest. It wasn't about being noticed by a prince. It was about being seen as a human being by someone who everyone else wanted something from. She finished her work on the doors, her reflection staring back at her, no longer just a uniform, but a woman with a name, a history, a home. The arrival of Prince Kalo had set the stage for a week of intense negotiations, a deal that promised to reshape the energy landscape of his kingdom and pour billions into Davenport's corporation. The entire top floor of the hotel had been converted into a command center for this corporate war game, and Ada's duties now included servicing the pre-function areas and the corridors outside the main conference room, a space now known among the staff as the Summit. The air outside the Summit was thick with a unique tension, a silent, high-stakes hum that seeped from beneath the heavy oak doors. For 2 days, Ada worked in that charged atmosphere, her silent routine a counterpoint to the drama unfolding with. Through the discreet opening and closing of the doors, she caught fragments of the conversation. The language was cold, transactional, words like asset monetization, depreciation schedules, sovereign risk, and profit repatriation flew like sterile shrapnel. It was the language of conquest, disguised as commerce. Mr. Davenport's voice was the most prominent, smooth and confident as he laid out the terms of his company's proposal. It was, by all accounts, a brilliant deal for his shareholders. It promised efficiency, speed, and a staggering return on investment. Yet, from the snippets she overheard, Ada sensed a deep disconnect. Prince Kalo's responses were infrequent and clipped. When he did speak, his voice carried a weight that seemed to search for something not present in Davenport's meticulously prepared presentations. He asked about job creation for local engineers, not just manual laborers. He questioned the environmental impact on the Niger Delta, a topic Davenport deflected with practiced ease, citing industry-standard mitigation protocols. Kalo asked about technology transfer, about building a self-sustaining infrastructure, about partnership. Davenport answered with numbers, with clauses, with termination rights. He was selling a product. Kalo was trying to build a future. Ada saw the frustration etched on the prince's face during the brief coffee breaks in the corridor. He would stand by the large window, gazing out at the alien cityscape, his shoulders tight with a burden the others couldn't comprehend. He wasn't just a businessman, he was a custodian of his people's legacy, a bridge between their past and their future. This deal was not merely about wealth, but about honor and responsibility. Davenport and his team seemed oblivious to this. They saw Kalo's questions not as legitimate concerns, but as obstacles to be managed, sentimentalities to be navigated around. They mistook his deliberation for indecisiveness, his sense of duty for commercial naivete. While polishing a credenza near the lounge area, Ada overheard Davenport speaking to one of his lieutenants in a hushed but agitated tone. "He's being emotional," Davenport complained. "We're offering him the deal of a lifetime, and he's hung up on community empowerment. We need to close this. The board is watching." The words stung Ada in a way she didn't expect. She thought of her father, a civil engineer whose dreams of building bridges in his own country had been thwarted by a lack of opportunity, forcing him to take lesser jobs, his potential slowly eroding like a riverbank in the rainy season. Kalo was fighting for men like her father, and Davenport was dismissing it as emotion. The conflict was more than a disagreement over contractual terms. It was a fundamental clash of worldviews. Kalo saw the proposed project as an ecosystem, a living thing that had to be integrated into the soil of his nation. He spoke of the land not as a resource to be exploited, but as an inheritance to be honored. He carried the weight of his ancestors' wisdom and the hopes of generations yet to come. He was trying to explain that true value wasn't just in the barrels of oil extracted, but in the knowledge transferred, the skills cultivated, and the dignity of the people affirmed. For him, a deal that enriched the foreign corporation while leaving his people as mere spectators to their own prosperity was not a deal at all. It was a dressed-up form of plunder. Davenport, on the other hand, saw a trend. He was a man of spreadsheets and bottom lines, a product of a culture where success was measured in quarterly earnings reports. To him, Kalo's insistence on what he deemed intangibles was a frustrating, time-consuming. He couldn't assign a monetary value to honor or legacy, so in his calculations, they were worthless. He believed he was offering a generous gift, a chance for a developing nation to get a taste of first-world efficiency. He failed to grasp that Kalo wasn't asking for a gift. He was demanding respect. In Kalo's mind, the negotiation had become a test. He was not just evaluating a business proposal, he was judging the character of his potential partner. He listened to their carefully crafted arguments, their promises of benevolent investment, but what he heard was the echo of a long and painful history. He heard the ghost of colonial administrators who spoke of civilizing missions, while stripping the land of its treasure. He saw in Davenport's condescending patience, the same paternalistic arrogance that had always underestimated his people. He felt a profound sense of isolation in that room, surrounded by men who could not, or would not, see the world through his eyes. The tension spilled out into the small, unguarded moments. Ada was replacing the water carafe inside the meeting room during a short recess, when she saw Davenport approach one of the younger hotel staff, a nervous young man from Bangladesh, who had spilled a small amount of coffee while refilling a cup. "Watch what you're doing, son," Davenport had snapped, his voice dripping with disdain. "This is a Zegna suit. It costs more than you make in a year." The young man stammered an apology, his face burning with shame. Davenport waved him away with a dismissive flick of his wrist, turning back to his conversation without a second thought. Ada's hands did not stop their work, but her heart grew cold. It was the casual cruelty of it, the effortless way he had stripped the young man of his dignity. In that small, ugly moment, Davenport had revealed everything about his character. He saw people as either useful tools or inconvenient obstacles. Kalo, who had been standing near the doorway, witnessed the entire exchange. His face remained impassive, but Ada saw a flicker of something in his eyes, a confirmation of his deepest fears about the men he was in business with. He looked past Davenport and his eyes briefly met Ada's once more. This time there was a shared understanding in his gaze, a silent acknowledgement of the ugliness they had both just witnessed. By the third day, the negotiations had reached a breaking point. The chasm between Kalo's vision of partnership and Davenport's rigid, extractive proposal seemed unbridgeable. The atmosphere in the summit was frigid. Davenport's manufactured smile had vanished, replaced by a tight, impatient scowl. His team shuffled their papers with a nervous energy, sensing the impending collapse of a deal they had spent months preparing. The deal was dying, and they were all just watching it happen. Davenport made one last, desperate push, reiterating the financial benefits, his voice tinged with an exasperation he could no longer conceal. "Your Highness," he said, the honorific now sounding more like an accusation, "these numbers are unprecedented. This is the best offer you will get anywhere. It is, frankly, more than generous." Kalo listened, his face a mask of stone. He let the silence hang in the air after Davenport finished, a heavy, suffocating blanket of unspoken frustration. He looked from one face to the next, at the eager, anxious, uncomprehending men who held his people's future in their hands, and saw only a balance sheet. A profound weariness settled over him, a longing for the wisdom of his elders, for a language that could convey the depth of his meaning, a language that understood that not everything of value could be counted. He leaned back in his leather chair, the sound of the soft creak echoing in the silent room. He turned to his aide, a trusted friend from his childhood, and the polished international English he had been speaking for days fell away. In its place a different cadence emerged, a sound that was rich and warm and ancient. He spoke in Yoruba, his voice low but clear, filled with a sudden, aching melancholy. Igikan kole da igbo she, he said, his words a foreign poetry in the sterile boardroom. A single tree cannot make a forest. The effect was instantaneous. It was as if a spell had been broken, or a new one cast. The flow of corporate jargon ceased. Davenport and his team froze, their faces a comical tableau of shock and confusion. Their fluency, their command of the language of power, was suddenly useless. They were adrift in a sea of sound they could not navigate. They exchanged panicked glances, their authority dissolving with every syllable Kalo uttered. He continued, his voice resonating with the pain of being fundamentally misunderstood. One or die, Igoanbo, Igilasan ni wanori. They don't see the roots, they only see the lumber. He was no longer speaking to them, but to himself, to his ancestors, to the very soul of the land he represented. In that moment, he was not a global billionaire in a suit. He was the son of his father, the guardian of his kingdom, speaking his heart in his mother tongue. The room was utterly, completely silent, save for the sound of a language that held more power than all their financial projections combined. Ada had been given permission to enter the room, to clear away the debris from the morning session. The executives, lost in their own tension, had forgotten she was even scheduled to come in. She moved with her usual quiet grace, her rubber-soled shoes making no sound on the thick carpet. Her focus was on the used coffee cups, the crumpled napkins, the small islands of disorder in a sea of corporate perfection. She was a whisper at the edge of their world, present but unheard. And then she heard it, the sound of Yoruba, clear and resonant, slicing through the strained silence. It was not the formal broadcast Yoruba of the radio news she sometimes streamed on her phone, but the deep proverbial Yoruba of the elders, the language of her grandmother's stories, of fireside chats and life lessons, wrapped in metaphor. It was the sound of home. It hit her not in the ears but in the chest. A wave of profound, unexpected emotion washed over her, a homesickness so sharp and sudden it almost made her gasp. For a moment the Regis Hotel dissolved, and she was a small girl again, sitting at her grandmother's feet, listening to tales of clever tortoises and proud lions. The prince's words, "A single tree cannot make a forest," echoed in the chamber of her memory. She knew she knew its meaning, its weight, its warning against arrogance and isolation. He spoke again, about seeing only the lumber and not the roots, and the corresponding proverb rose in her mind unbidden, a reflexive response learned in childhood. She continued her task, collecting a porcelain saucer, her movements automatic. Her mind, however, was miles and years away, lost in the cadence of her native tongue. Her grandmother's voice was clear in her head, teaching her the other half of the lesson. It was a truth so fundamental, so deeply ingrained in her, that it felt like breathing. Without conscious thought, without weighing the consequences or considering the utter madness of the act, her voice was soft, not much more than a murmur, but in the supernaturally silent room, it was as clear as a bell. Sugbon igi, iroko, toga, yulo papa, berigega, bso kekere, tomo ile, she said, her gaze still on the cup in her hand. But even the tallest iroko tree began as a seed that knew the soil. She placed the cup on her tray with a faint click, the sound as loud as a gunshot in the stillness. And then she moved to the next one, her body continuing its dance of service, as if she had done nothing more than whisper a quiet apology for her intrusion. For a long stretched-out moment, nothing happened. The world seemed to hold its breath. The only sound was the faint hum of the air conditioning. Then slowly, as if moving through water, every head in the room turned, not towards the prince, but towards the woman in the simple gray uniform, now standing by the credenza with a silver tray in her hands. Mr. Davenport's face was a wreck of conflicting emotions. His jaw was slack with disbelief, his eyes wide with a confusion that was rapidly souring into outrage. Who was this non-entity, this cleaning lady, who dared to speak in this secret language in the middle of his multi-billion-dollar negotiation? He looked as if she had pulled a live animal from her pocket. The other executives were equally stunned,
their faces blank masks of incomprehension. They looked at Ada, then at Prince Kalo, then back at Ada, as if trying to solve an impossible equation. But it was Kalo's reaction that held the room captive. He did not look angry or offended. He looked thunderstruck. He stared at Ada, his weariness and frustration completely gone, replaced by an intense, focused astonishment. The proverb she had spoken was not just a clever reply, it was a direct, profound answer to the lament he had just uttered. He had spoken of their blindness to the roots, and she had responded with the wisdom of the seed. It was a conceptual and linguistic masterstroke, delivered from the most unexpected source imaginable. Slowly, he leaned forward, his eyes never leaving her face. "Tune so," he commanded softly, in Yoruba. "Say it again." Ada froze. The spell was broken. She was suddenly terrifyingly aware of what she had done. The weight of every eye in the room pressed down on her. Her heart hammered against her ribs. She was just the cleaner. She had spoken out of turn. She had crossed an invisible line that was more real and more dangerous than any wall. She squeezed her eyes shut for a second, a silent prayer on her lips. Then she opened them and, summoning a courage she didn't know she possessed, she lifted her head and looked directly at the prince. She repeated the words, her voice a little stronger this time, clearer, imbued with the simple, unassailable truth of the proverb itself. Even the tallest Iroko tree began as a seed that knew the soil. A slow smile spread across Kalo Abioya's face. It transformed him, erasing the last traces of the weary executive and revealing the soul of the man beneath. He saw her then, truly saw her, not as a function or a uniform, but as a vessel of wisdom, a kindred spirit. "Kimi Oruko Rei," he asked gently. "What is your name?" "Ada," she replied, her voice barely a whisper. "Ada, Bello." Kalo nodded slowly. Then he turned his gaze to the stunned and silent Mr. Davenport. "Gentlemen," he said, his English returning but carrying a new, decisive authority, "I believe we will take a brief recess, a long one." The executives filed out of the room in a state of bewildered silence. Their confident strides had been replaced by a hesitant shuffle. The power dynamic of the entire negotiation had been upended, not by a counteroffer or a legal threat, but by a proverb spoken by a cleaner. Mr. Davenport shot Ada a look of pure venom as he passed, a look that promised retribution. But the threat felt hollow. His power in that room had been neutralized. Prince Kalo waited until the door clicked shut, leaving only himself, his trusted aide, and Ada in the vast silent space. The grand conference room, which had moments before been a corporate battlefield, now felt like a sanctuary. Kalo gestured to the chair opposite him, one of the expensive leather seats recently vacated by a top executive. "Please, Ada Bello," he said, in English, his tone gentle but firm. "Sit." Ada hesitated, her hands clutching the handle of her cleaning cart, as if it were a life raft. To sit at that table felt like a transgression far greater than the one she had already committed. But the prince's eyes were kind, and his request was not a suggestion. She slowly pushed her cart to the side and walked to the table, perching cautiously on the edge of the chair. It was the first time she had sat in a chair like this, a throne of corporate power, and it felt deeply strange. Kalo spoke to her in Yoruba, his voice warm and familiar. He asked her not about the deal or the proverb, but about herself. He asked where in Nigeria she was from. He asked about her family. His questions were simple, direct, and full of genuine curiosity. He was not interrogating her. He was getting to know her. With a quiet, halting voice, Ada began to speak. She told him about growing up in Iba, about her grandmother, who filled her head with stories and wisdom. She told him about her degree in architecture from the University of Lagos, about her dreams of designing buildings that were both beautiful and functional, buildings that worked in harmony with the environment, not against it. She told him about the circumstances that had led her to America, the family obligations, the search for opportunity that had led not to a design firm, but to a hotel corridor. She spoke without embellishment or self-pity, stating the facts of her life with a simple, resilient dignity. Kalo listened with an attentiveness that was absolute. He did not interrupt. He did not check his phone. He just listened. In her story, in her quiet intelligence, and her vast, untapped potential, He found the living embodiment of everything he had been trying to make Davenport understand. She was the seed that knew the soil. She was the human potential his country was full of, the very thing he was fighting to cultivate. Her simple, profound proverb had not been a lucky guess. It was the product of a deep cultural and intellectual wellspring that the world had deemed fit only for scrubbing floors. The irony was as bitter as it was illuminating. After nearly an hour, Prince Kalo nodded slowly, a deep and thoughtful expression on his face. He thanked Ada, in Yoruba, a phrase of profound respect that one might offer an elder. Then he switched back to perfect, crisp English and had his aides summon Mr. Davenport and his team back into the room. The executives filed back in, their faces a mixture of anxiety and resentment. They took their seats, their eyes flicking nervously between the prince and the cleaner who now sat at their table. Davenport's face was a thunderclap. He opened his mouth to speak, likely to demand an explanation for this bizarre interruption, but Kalo raised a hand, silencing him instantly. "Mr. Davenport," Kalo began, his voice calm and measured, but with an underlying edge of steel. "For 3 days, I have tried to explain the principle at the heart of my vision for this project. I have spoken of partnership, of legacy, of sustainable growth. You have responded with spreadsheets and liability clauses." He paused, letting the words sink in. "You did not understand. Perhaps it is because you were not listening to my words, but only waiting for your turn to speak." He then turned his gaze to Ada, his expression softening. "This woman," he said, his voice ringing with authority, in 10 seconds and with one sentence, managed to encapsulate the entire philosophy upon which this deal must be built. He then repeated the proverb for the benefit of the room. "Even the tallest iroko tree began as a seed that knew the soil." She reminded me of something I had almost forgotten in this sterile room, that all great things, all strong things, must start from a foundation of respect for where they are planted. They must know the soil. He looked back at Davenport, his eyes hard. "The deal you have proposed does not know the soil. It seeks only to take the lumber. Therefore, that deal is dead." A collective gasp went through Davenport's team. Their faces paled. "However," Kalo continued, "I am willing to begin a new negotiation, one based on a new foundation. We will build a true partnership. We will invest in local talent. We will ensure that the primary beneficiary of this project is the nation of Nigeria." He leaned forward. "And my first condition is this. The project will require a cultural and community liaison, someone who understands the land, the people, and the proverbs, someone who can be the bridge between your corporate world and my reality." He did not need to say her name. He simply looked at Ada, whose eyes were wide with a dawning, unbelievable hope. Davenport stared, his mouth opening and closing silently, the gears of his mind grinding as he finally belatedly understood. He had not only been outmaneuvered, he had been given a masterclass in what true power looked like. It wasn't about shouting the loudest. It was about having the wisdom to listen to the quietest voice in the room. The transformation was immediate and profound. The news of what had happened in the summit spread through the hotel's arteries, not like gossip, but like a modern folktale. The story of the quiet cleaner who had silenced a room of millionaires and advised a prince became a source of immense pride among the staff. They looked at Ada differently, but more importantly, they began to look at themselves differently. The invisible people, who cleaned the rooms, served the food, and carried the luggage, suddenly felt a little more visible. They were reminded that within each of them was a story, a history, a hidden well of knowledge, or talent, that the world had not yet seen, now coming to life. Her success was not a fairy tale ending. It was the logical outcome of talent finally meeting opportunity. And in this story lies a simple, powerful truth. Our world is full of quiet people, people we have been conditioned to overlook. We build hierarchies of value based on job titles, bank accounts, and the language someone speaks. We create invisible walls that prevent us from seeing the immense, untapped potential that resides in the hearts and minds of those who serve us, who clean up after us, who move silently in the background of our busy lives. We are all guilty of seeing the uniform and not the person, of hearing an accent and making an assumption, of valuing the lumber while remaining blind to the roots. But what if we chose to see differently? What if we understood that the person cleaning our office might hold the key to a problem we can't solve, that the wisdom we seek in expensive consultants might be found in a simple proverb from a grandmother in a faraway land. True connection, true progress, begins when we have the humility to listen, the grace to see the humanity in everyone, and the wisdom to recognize that the most powerful voice is not always the loudest one. It is often the one that speaks a truth so fundamental, it can change the world in a single, quiet sentence.
Affairs. I had laid out the problem, the consequences, and the solution. The power dynamic had been completely inverted. The ball was now in his court, a court he had never actually had to play on before. The quiet satisfaction I felt was not of triumph, but of restored order. The numbers on the balance sheet were finally starting to make sense again. The weekend that followed our conversation was, I imagine, one of frantic discussion and panicked calculations at Michael and Ashley's house. The reality of a nearly $3,000 mortgage payment, plus late fees, had landed squarely in their laps. It was a sum their lifestyle of casual brunches and expensive coffee machines was not equipped to handle. My phone remained silent. This didn't surprise me. They were likely exploring every possible avenue before having to come back to me. They would be looking at their savings, a concept I suspected was largely theoretical to them, and finding them wanting. They would be scrutinizing their budget, a document that probably didn't exist in any formal sense. The arrogant, dismissive antagonists were being forced into a crash course in financial reality. On Monday morning, I received a call from my sister, Eleanor. "Arthur, I just had the strangest conversation with Michael," she said, her voice a mixture of confusion and concern. "He was asking me if I knew whether you were having financial difficulties." I had to smile. This was a predictable move. Unable to accept the truth, he was casting about for an alternative explanation, one that painted him as the concerned son rather than the cause of the problem. "And what did you tell him?" I asked, already knowing the answer. "I told him you were the most financially prudent person I know, and that if you were having difficulties, the entire global economy was probably on the verge of collapse," she said dryly. Then he started mumbling something about a misunderstanding with the bank. "Arthur, what's going on?" It was time to bring my ally into the inner circle. I took a deep breath. I've stopped paying his mortgage." I explained everything to her. The Thanksgiving call, the years of being taken for granted, the finality of my decision. I told her about our conversation on Friday, about framing it as a business decision. She was quiet for a long time after I finished. "Good for you," she finally said, her voice firm. "It's about damn time. You raised a son, not a dependent." It was a hard lesson to teach, but it sounds like you're the only one who could teach it. Her support was a relief. Having her understand the why behind my actions was important to me. She was the one person who had seen my growing frustration over the years. That afternoon, the inevitable happened. An email from Ashley landed in my inbox. The subject line was "checking in." The tone was a complete departure from her usual breezy, emoji-laden style. It was formal, cautious, and reeked of desperation. "Dear Arthur," it began, "I hope you are well. Michael and I were so sorry to hear that you've been having some financial concerns. We were, of course, very alarmed to learn about the missed mortgage payment. We have been in contact with the bank and are working to resolve the situation. We were wondering if you might have some time to talk later this week, to discuss the best path forward." It was a masterpiece of passive-aggressive corporate speak. The blame was subtly shifted to my supposed financial concerns. They were working to resolve a situation they had no idea how to resolve. And the request to discuss the best path forward was a thinly veiled plea for me to turn the money back on. I saw my son's hand in the phrasing, the vague, non-committal language of a mid-level manager trying to placate an unhappy client. They were still underestimating me, still treating me as a problem to be managed, rather than a person to be respected. My reply was concise and to the point. "Ashley, thank you for your email. To be clear, I am having no financial difficulties. My decision to cease the mortgage payments was a strategic one, based on the terms of our informal joint venture no longer being met. The path forward is straightforward. You and Michael need to make the December payment immediately to avoid further penalties and credit damage. Once you have done so, you will need to continue making the payments on a monthly basis. The bank can provide you with the necessary information to set up direct payments from your own account. I am of course happy to provide you with copies of the past statements for your records. I am available to meet if you wish to discuss the legal process of having my name removed as co-signer, an action I believe would be in the best interests of all parties. Regards, Arthur. I hit send with a sense of finality. I had refused to play their game of misunderstandings and concerns. I had reiterated the facts of the situation and laid out the only acceptable solution. I had also introduced the next logical step, my complete financial disentanglement from their lives. The threat of removing myself as cosigner was a powerful one. Without me, they would have to refinance, an impossibility given their income-to-debt ratio, and the now imminent black mark on their credit history. The carefully constructed world of my son and his fiancée was unraveling, thread by thread. The climax was approaching, and it would not be a shouting match, but a quiet surrender to the irrefutable logic of the numbers on a page. The meeting was set for the following Saturday. They chose a neutral location, a sterile conference room at a local library that could be booked by the hour. It was a telling choice, an acknowledgement that this was not a family get-together. This was a negotiation. I arrived 5 minutes early, a habit ingrained by decades of professional practice. I carried a slim leather portfolio containing my paperwork, the summary sheet, the chronological mortgage statements, and a copy of the original loan agreement. I was prepared. They arrived exactly on time, a united front of anxiety and resentment. Michael looked tired, the stress of the past week etched around his eyes. Ashley wore a severe black pantsuit, an outfit I suspected was meant to project an air of businesslike competence, but which only served to highlight her youth and inexperience. They sat opposite me at the long, polished table. "Thank you for meeting with us, Dad," Michael began, his voice strained. Ashley remained silent, her hands clasped tightly in front of her. "Of course," I said, my tone calm and even. I opened my portfolio and laid the summary sheet on the table, turning it so they could read it. I thought it would be helpful to start with the facts. Michael glanced at the paper, his eyes widening slightly as he saw the total figure, $62,154.75. He had never seen the cost of his lifestyle quantified in such stark terms. "As you can see," I continued, "my investment in this property has been substantial. For 2 years, I have covered the entire mortgage, ensuring that your primary asset was secure. This was based on an informal agreement, an understanding that in return for this significant financial support, a certain level of familial respect and inclusion would be maintained." Ashley finally spoke, her voice sharp. "We've always been respectful, Arthur." "Have you?" I replied, my gaze steady. "Was it respectful to inform me, 10 days before a major family holiday, that I was being excluded in favor of your parents? Was it respectful to treat me as a financial utility, to be relied upon but otherwise ignored? My phone calls with my son have become a litany of household problems requiring a financial solution. The relationship has become purely transactional. The Thanksgiving call was simply the final transaction in a long series of them, and it made me realize that the terms of our agreement were no longer being met. I let the words settle in the quiet room. They had no response. The truth, laid out so plainly, was irrefutable. "I don't expect you to pay me back," I said, a statement that seemed to surprise them. "Consider that $62,000 a final gift, a severance package, if you will, from our financial partnership. What I do expect is for you to take responsibility for your own lives, starting now." I pushed a second document across the table. It was a printout from the mortgage company's website, detailing how to set up online payments. "The December payment is now critically overdue. You need to pay it today. If you don't have the funds in your checking account, you'll need to transfer them from your savings, or, if necessary, use a credit card, though I would strongly advise against the latter due to the high interest rates." The mention of credit cards was a deliberate, calculated jab, a reminder of their casual spending habits. Michael looked down at the table, his shoulders slumped in defeat. The entire edifice of their comfortable life was a sham, built on my money and their irresponsible choices. "Then you have a serious problem," I said, my voice devoid of sympathy. "You have a lifestyle that you cannot afford. You will have to make some difficult choices. You may have to sell the house. Given the equity that has accrued, thanks to my payments, you would likely walk away with a small profit. You could use that to find a more affordable place to live, perhaps an apartment that is within your actual budget." The word apartment hung in the air like a death sentence. To them, the house was a symbol of their success, of their arrival into a certain social stratum. The thought of giving it up was clearly devastating. This was the climax, not a fiery explosion, but the quiet, crushing weight of reality. The antagonists, so full of arrogance and entitlement just a few weeks ago, were now facing the consequences of their actions. They were seeing their future, a future without my safety net. and it terrified them. "I will not be reinstating the payments," I said, my voice firm. "And I will be contacting my lawyer on Monday to begin the process of having my name removed from the loan. You will need to refinance. Whether the bank will allow that, given your financial situation and the imminent credit damage, is uncertain. That is the situation you have created for yourselves." I stood up, placing my documents back in my portfolio. "I believe we're done here." I had said everything I needed to say. The rest was up to them. The lesson was over. The tuition was now due. The aftermath was not swift, but it was decisive. The meeting in the library conference room had been the turning point. Stripped of their assumptions, and faced with the stark reality of their finances, Michael and Ashley were forced to act. A week after our meeting, I saw a significant withdrawal from a joint investment account I had set up for Michael years ago. An account I knew he had largely forgotten about. It was just enough to cover the overdue December mortgage payment and the late fees. It was a stopgap, a temporary plug in a dam that was about to burst, but it was an action. They had chosen to sacrifice a piece of their future to salvage their present. My lawyer, a sharp and efficient man named David, began the process of formally requesting my removal as cosigner. As expected, the bank refused. A cosigner is a form of insurance, and they were not about to let their policy lapse, especially now that the primary borrowers had proven themselves to be a risk. This forced Michael and Ashley's hand. Their only option was to sell the house. The for sale sign went up in their front yard, just after New Year's. It was a quiet, public admission of defeat. The house sold quickly, the market being what it was. As I had predicted, the equity I had built for them provided a small but not insignificant profit. They walked away with enough money for a security deposit, and several months' rent on a small apartment on the other side of town, far from the trendy neighborhood they had been so proud of. The grand two-story colonial was replaced by a two-bedroom walk-up. The fancy outdoor kitchen was gone, replaced by a galley kitchen with aging appliances. The life of casual luxury they had taken for granted had evaporated. I did not gloat. I felt a quiet, somber satisfaction. This was not a victory. It was a necessary, painful correction. It was the restoration of a natural order. A parent's job is to prepare their children for the world, not to shield them from it indefinitely. I had failed in that for many years, and this was the long overdue remedy. Our relationship, of course, was fundamentally altered. The phone calls ceased for a while. The silence was heavy with unspoken resentment. Then, one evening in early spring, my phone rang. It was Michael. "Hey, Dad," he said. His voice was different. The forced brightness was gone, replaced by a quiet, hesitant tone. I just wanted to call. No reason." We talked for a few minutes, about my work, about the weather. It was awkward, stilted, but it was real. It was the first time in years that he had called without needing something. It was a small, tentative step towards rebuilding something new, something based not on dependency, but on a shared, if difficult, history. A few weeks later, a letter arrived. It was a single sheet of paper, a handwritten note from Michael. "Dad," it read, "I've been doing a lot of thinking. I understand now. I'm sorry." It was not a full apology, not a detailed accounting of his transgressions, but it was enough. It was an acknowledgement. It was a start. I put the note in my desk drawer, next to the file labeled MP Property. The account was finally, truly, closed. My name is Arthur Pendleton, 58 years old, and I am a father again, not a bank. My son is learning to be a man, not a liability. The future is uncertain, as all futures are, but for the first time in a long time, our family's emotional balance sheet is starting to look solvent. And for an old accountant like me, that is a source of quiet, profound peace. The process of rebuilding was slow, like the recovery from a long illness. There were no grand gestures, no tearful reunions. It was a series of small, almost imperceptible shifts. The phone calls from Michael became more regular, once a week, usually on a Sunday evening. We talked about his new job. He'd taken a second part-time position at a local hardware store to make ends meet, and the challenges of apartment living. He complained about the noisy neighbors and the temperamental plumbing, but there was a new quality to his complaints. They were the grumblings of a man grappling with his own reality, not the veiled requests of a dependent. He never asked for money, not once. One Saturday, he called and asked if I needed a hand with anything around the house. "I'm getting pretty good at fixing leaky faucets," he said, a hint of self-deprecating humor in his voice. I told him my garage door had been sticking. He came over that afternoon. He brought his own tools. We spent a few hours working on the door, a simple shared task that felt more meaningful than any of the expensive dinners we had shared in the past. We didn't talk about the unpleasantness of the past winter. We didn't need to. The shared work, the quiet companionship, was its own form of communication. Ashley remained distant for much longer. I understood. Her dream of a certain kind of life had been dismantled, and she undoubtedly held me responsible. But even she began to thaw, slowly. I received a polite, if brief, birthday card in May. It was a small thing, but it was a signal, a crack of light in the wall she had built. The biggest change, however, was in me. Releasing the burden of their financial dependency had freed me in ways I hadn't anticipated. I had more disposable income, of course, but it was more than that. I had more mental and emotional energy. I started taking on new clients, more challenging and interesting work that I had previously shied away from, not wanting the extra stress. I reconnected with old friends. I even booked a trip to Italy, something I had talked about doing for years but had always postponed, telling myself I needed to keep my resources available just in case. There were no more just-in-case scenarios to worry about. My contingency plans had been for them, not for me. Now, I was finally planning for myself. I established a formal trust for my future grandchildren, to be managed by an independent trustee. It would provide for their education, a legitimate and structured form of support, not the chaotic, on-demand funding I had provided for Michael. It was a lesson learned, a mistake I would not repeat. The relationship with my son was not what it once was. The easy, unthinking closeness of his childhood was gone forever. In its place was something more complex, more adult. It was a relationship between two men who had been through a difficult, clarifying fire. It was marked by a new, hard-won respect. One evening, Michael called me. He and Ashley had just signed a new lease on their apartment. "We got a slightly better interest rate on our credit cards," he said, and I could hear the pride in his voice. "We've been paying them down every month. Our credit score is slowly starting to recover." It was a small victory, but it was his. He was learning the language of financial responsibility, the quiet satisfaction of managing one's own affairs. "That's good, son," I said. "That's very good." The resolution was not a fairy tale ending where everything went back to normal. It was something far more realistic, and ultimately, more satisfying. The antagonist had been forced to become a protagonist in his own life, and I, the quiet, methodical planner, had finally achieved a positive return on my investment. It wasn't monetary, but it was invaluable. It was the return of my son. The quiet rhythm of our new relationship continued to establish itself over the next year. The weekly phone calls became a fixture, a comfortable touchstone for both of us. The conversations expanded beyond the immediate challenges of his budget to include his thoughts on his work, his hopes for the future, the simple day-to-day details of his life. He was becoming a person to me again, not just a problem to be solved. Ashley, too, slowly re-emerged. One day, I received a text from her with a photo of a lopsided, slightly burnt cake. The caption read, "My first attempt at baking from scratch. Tastes better than it looks, I promise." It was a peace offering, a gesture of humility that would have been unthinkable a year prior. I replied, "Practice makes perfect. Looks like a good start." I knew how much that small admission of imperfection must have cost her. It was a sign that she, too, was learning to live without the pretense that had once been so important to her. My role as an ally had shifted. I was no longer the silent financial backer. I became a sounding board, an advisor. Michael would occasionally ask for my opinion on financial matters. A new savings account he was considering, a question about his taxes. I would give him my professional, objective advice, the same as I would for any client. I never offered to do it for him. I taught him how to fish. I no longer provided the fish. He had to learn to do the work himself. This was the core of our new contract. One of the most telling moments came a few weeks before Thanksgiving, almost a year to the day from the inciting incident. Michael called me. "Hey Dad," he said, his voice steady. "I know it's early, but Ashley and I were wondering what your plans were for Thanksgiving. We were thinking of having a small dinner at our apartment. It won't be anything fancy, but we'd really love for you to come." The humility in his offer was profound. He was not assuming my presence, he was requesting it. He was acknowledging that my time and company were things to be valued, not demanded. The contrast with the previous year's phone call was stark. "I would like that very much, Michael," I said, a genuine warmth spreading through my chest. Just tell me what I can bring. The cycle had come full circle. The initial betrayal, the quiet planning, the calculated execution of my plan, the confrontation, and finally the resolution. It had all led to this, a simple invitation, freely given and gratefully accepted. The core narrative loop was complete. The protagonist, a man who had felt invisible in his own family, had been vindicated not through revenge, but through the quiet assertion of his own value. The antagonists, their world of entitlement shattered, had been forced to grow, to adapt, to become self-reliant. It was a form of justice, not the loud, triumphant kind seen in movies, but the quiet, satisfying justice of a balanced ledger. I had my son back, not as a dependent, but as a man. And as I looked ahead to the holiday, to a simple meal in a small apartment, I knew it would be the most satisfying Thanksgiving I had had in years. The quiet professional had completed his most important audit, and the books were finally, definitively, in balance.